Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that in the early hours of February 12th, 2026, Canada quietly activated a strategic energy protocol that cut off 43% of the United States' total energy supply, and that this single decision represents the most consequential use of geographic leverage in North American history? And ask yourself this: in a world where energy security determines the rise and fall of nations, what does it mean when the country that has powered American prosperity for decades suddenly decides to keep that power for itself? The numbers are staggering. Canada supplies the United States with 4.1 million barrels of crude oil per day, 63 terawatt hours of electricity annually, and 18% of America's natural gas consumption. We are not just America's largest foreign energy supplier. We are America's energy lifeline. But here's what most people don't realize. This relationship was never about American strength. It was about Canadian generosity, and generosity can be withdrawn. To understand the magnitude of what Canada has accomplished, we must examine the cold, hard geography that makes this dominance possible. Energy is not just about having resources. It is about having the right resources in the right places connected by the right infrastructure. And in this equation, Canada holds all the cards. Let us start with oil, the foundation of modern civilization. The Athabasca oil sands contain 165 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil. Saudi Arabia has proven reserves of 267 billion barrels. But here's the critical difference. Saudi oil sits in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. Canadian oil sits in the most stable democracy in the Western Hemisphere, protected by geography and connected to American markets by the most sophisticated pipeline network ever constructed. But the genius of Canada's position lies in quality and strategic necessity. American refineries were specifically designed to process heavy crude oil. This is not an accident. It is decades of integration between Canadian supply and American demand. The refineries in Minnesota, Illinois, Ohio, and Texas are not just importing Canadian oil, they are dependent on Canadian oil. They cannot simply switch to lighter crude without massive, costly modifications. This creates supply chain lock-in. American refineries have invested hundreds of billions in equipment specifically designed for Canadian heavy crude. Changing suppliers would require rebuilding entire facilities, a process taking years and costing more than many companies are worth. This is not about preference or economics. This is about industrial survival. The pipeline infrastructure connecting Canada to the United States represents one of the most sophisticated energy networks in history. The Keystone system can transport 830,000 barrels per day from Alberta to Illinois and Texas. The Enbridge system moves 3.2 million barrels daily. The Trans Mountain expansion adds another 890,000 barrels of daily capacity. But here's what makes this infrastructure truly strategic. It was built with Canadian resources, on Canadian soil, under Canadian sovereignty. Every valve, pump station, and monitoring facility from the oil sands to the American border is under Canadian control. The United States may be the destination, but Canada controls the tap. The decision to reduce oil exports by 31% beginning February 12th was presented as the National Energy Security Initiative, prioritizing Canadian energy independence over export revenues. Within 48 hours, gasoline prices in the American Midwest rose 23 cents per gallon. Diesel increased 31 cents. Heating oil in the Northeast spiked 18%. These were immediate supply shock reactions that sent tremors through the American economy. The American energy sector's response was panicked. The American Petroleum Institute called Canada's decision a threat to North American energy security. Texas Oil and Gas warned of refineries operating below capacity. The Department of Energy announced emergency releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to compensate for the Canadian shortfall. But oil is only the beginning. Canada produces more than twice the electricity it consumes, with much surplus flowing south to power American cities with no alternative sources. Quebec generates 36.8 terawatt hours of surplus hydroelectric power annually to New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire. British Columbia exports 12.4 terawatt hours to Washington, Oregon, and California. Ontario supplies critical power to Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The geography making this possible is irreplaceable. Canada has the Canadian Shield, creating natural valleys perfect for dam construction. We have massive river systems with consistent water flow. We have vast uninhabited territories where large hydroelectric projects can be built without displacing populations. Most importantly, we have political stability allowing massive infrastructure investments requiring 15 to 20 years to complete. Natural gas represents the third pillar of Canadian energy dominance. Canada supplies 18% of American natural gas consumption from Alberta and British Columbia. This gas heats American homes, powers electricity plants, and fuels industries from steel to petrochemicals. The pipeline network delivering this gas represents billions in infrastructure and decades of regulatory approvals. The strategic brilliance lies in seasonal demand patterns. American consumption peaks during winter heating and summer cooling when alternatives are most scarce and expensive. Canada's decision to prioritize domestic supply during these peaks creates maximum pressure on American energy security. The infrastructure investments enabling Canada's energy export restrictions were not built overnight. The National Energy Security Initiative represents a comprehensive strategy developing for over 2 years, based on a simple recognition. Energy security is national security, and nations that export their energy security export their sovereignty. The domestic refining expansion represents the most visible component. Since 2024, Canada has invested $47 billion in new refinery capacity and upgrading facilities. The Irving Oil Refinery in New Brunswick has been expanded to process an additional 200,000 barrels per day. The Sturgeon Refinery in Alberta has doubled capacity. 3 entirely new refineries have been constructed in strategic locations. These investments mean Canada no longer needs to export raw crude oil and import refined products. We can process our own oil into gasoline, diesel, and petrochemicals for domestic use and export to markets other than the United States. This eliminates one of the most illogical aspects of our historical relationship with American energy markets. The electricity storage and grid modernization projects represent an equally important component. Canada has invested $23 billion in battery storage, smart grid technology, and interprovincial transmission lines, allowing us to store surplus hydroelectric power and distribute it efficiently. This means Canadian electricity no longer needs to flow south to find markets. The natural gas strategy focuses on diversification and value-added processing. Rather than simply exporting raw natural gas to American markets, Canada is building liquefied natural gas facilities that can ship Canadian energy to Asia, Europe, and elsewhere. The LNG Canada facility in British Columbia exports 14 million tons annually. This infrastructure allows Canada to treat natural gas as a truly global commodity rather than a continental resource, tied exclusively to American demand. When Canadian natural gas can reach markets in Japan, South Korea, and Germany, American buyers lose their monopoly position and must compete on price and terms with customers around the world. The comprehensive economic impacts of Canada's strategic energy pivot are already reshaping both countries in fundamental ways that will define the next generation. In Canada, the domestic energy processing sector has created over 180,000 new jobs in high-paying, high-skill industries. The refinery expansions in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick have attracted billions in private investment and transformed communities that were previously dependent on raw resource extraction into centers of advanced manufacturing. The electricity sector has seen similar transformation. The battery storage facilities and smart grid investments have attracted technology companies, data centers, and energy-intensive industries that want access to reliable, clean, affordable power. The aluminum smelting industry, which requires massive amounts of electricity, has expanded significantly in Quebec and British Columbia. Cryptocurrency mining operations, despite their controversial environmental impact, have brought hundreds of millions in investment to regions with surplus hydroelectric capacity. Most importantly, the energy security strategy has eliminated Canada's historical vulnerability to American energy price manipulation and demand fluctuations. For decades, Canadian energy producers were price takers in American markets, accepting whatever prices American buyers were willing to pay because they had no alternative customers. This relationship kept Canadian energy prices artificially low and prevented the development of domestic energy processing industries. The diversification of Canadian energy markets has fundamentally altered this dynamic. Canadian oil, electricity, and natural gas now compete in global markets where supply and demand determine prices, rather than political relationships or historical precedents. This has resulted in higher revenues for Canadian energy producers, higher royalty payments to provincial governments, and higher investment levels in Canadian energy infrastructure. The American impacts have been equally significant, but far more disruptive. The reduction in Canadian energy imports has forced American utilities, refineries, and industrial users to seek alternative supplies at higher costs and with greater supply chain risks. American gasoline prices have increased by an average of 31 cents per gallon since the Canadian restrictions began. Industrial electricity costs have risen by 12% in regions that previously depended on Canadian imports. More seriously, the Canadian energy restrictions have exposed fundamental weaknesses in American energy infrastructure and planning. American energy policy for the past 3 decades has been based on the assumption that Canadian supplies would remain available, affordable, and reliable regardless of political relationships or trade disputes. This assumption allowed American policymakers to focus on other priorities while neglecting domestic energy security and supply chain resilience. The result is an American energy system that is efficient when everything works as expected, but fragile when supply chains are disrupted. American refineries cannot quickly switch from Canadian heavy crude to alternative suppliers without expensive modifications. American electricity grids cannot easily replace lost Canadian imports with domestic generation. American natural gas distribution systems cannot quickly adapt to reduced Canadian supplies during peak demand periods. The strategic genius of Canada's position becomes clear when we examine the geographic and logistical challenges facing American efforts to reduce dependence on Canadian energy. Energy infrastructure is not like other industries that can be quickly relocated or reconfigured in response to changing political or economic conditions. Energy infrastructure requires massive capital investments, long regulatory approval processes, and decades of operational experience to achieve reliability and efficiency. Consider the challenge facing American oil refineries that want to reduce their dependence on Canadian crude. Alternative suppliers exist, but they present significant disadvantages. Middle Eastern oil requires expensive shipping across oceans and through politically unstable regions. Venezuelan oil comes from a country with unreliable production and hostile political relationships. Mexican oil production has been declining for years and cannot meet American demand levels. Most importantly, alternative oils often have different chemical characteristics that require expensive refinery modifications. Light, sweet crude from American shale fields burns cleaner, but requires different processing equipment than the heavy crude from Canadian oil sands. Refineries that want to switch suppliers must often rebuild significant portions of their facilities, a process that takes years and costs billions of dollars. The electricity situation presents even greater challenges for American energy independence. Unlike oil, which can be transported by ship, truck, or pipeline from distant sources, electricity must be generated close to where it is consumed and transmitted through physical grid connections. American efforts to replace lost Canadian electricity imports require building new power plants, transmission lines, and grid infrastructure within American territory. The scale of this challenge is enormous. Canada exports enough electricity to the United States to power approximately 12 million American homes. Replacing this capacity would require building dozens of new power plants, hundreds of miles of new transmission lines, and billions of dollars in grid infrastructure. Even if American policymakers made this a national priority and allocated unlimited funding, the regulatory approval and construction timeline would extend well into the 2030s. Natural gas presents similar challenges with additional seasonal complications. American natural gas production has increased dramatically due to hydraulic fracturing technology, but American consumption has increased even faster due to the retirement of coal power plants and increased industrial demand. The United States is actually a net importer of natural gas, despite being one of the world's largest producers. Replacing Canadian natural gas imports would require either increasing American domestic production or developing alternative import sources. Increasing domestic production faces environmental opposition, regulatory constraints, and geological limitations. Alternative import sources exist in the form of liquefied natural gas from overseas suppliers, but LNG requires expensive import terminals and specialized shipping that cannot quickly scale up to meet American demand. If you are finding this analysis of Canada's energy dominance valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to provide in-depth coverage of the geographic and economic forces that are reshaping North America and the world. The long-term implications of Canada's energy strategy extend far beyond the immediate supply disruptions and price increases. What we are witnessing is the emergence of Canada as a true energy superpower that uses its geographic advantages strategically rather than simply accepting whatever terms larger neighbors choose to offer. This represents a fundamental shift in the North American balance of power that will define the relationship between our countries for decades to come. The historical precedent for this kind of energy leverage is limited but instructive. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 demonstrated how energy exporting countries could use supply restrictions to achieve political objectives and reshape international relationships. However, the Arab embargo was a temporary measure by a coalition of countries responding to a specific political crisis. Canada's energy pivot is a permanent restructuring of North American energy relationships based on long-term strategic planning and infrastructure development. The embargo comparison also highlights the unique advantages of Canada's geographic position. The Arab oil embargo succeeded because Middle Eastern producers controlled a large share of global oil exports and could coordinate their actions effectively. However, the embargo also created incentives for consuming countries to develop alternative supplies and reduce their dependence on Middle Eastern oil over time. Canada's energy strategy is more sophisticated and sustainable than historical embargo models. Rather than simply restricting exports to create short-term pressure, Canada is using its energy resources to build domestic industries, develop alternative markets, and create permanent infrastructure that reduces dependence on American buyers. This approach generates economic benefits for Canada, while reducing the ability of American buyers to simply wait out temporary supply restrictions. The environmental implications of Canada's energy strategy deserve careful consideration because they challenge conventional assumptions about energy transitions and climate policy. Critics argue that prioritizing Canadian energy exports over environmental concerns represents a step backward from climate commitments and renewable energy development. However, this criticism misunderstands both the environmental realities of global energy markets and the strategic nature of Canada's approach. Canadian oil, electricity, and natural gas are among the cleanest and most environmentally responsible energy sources available in global markets. Canadian oil production is subject to strict environmental regulations, carbon pricing, and technological standards that do not exist in many alternative producing countries. Canadian hydroelectric power is completely renewable and produces no carbon emissions during operation. Canadian natural gas burns cleaner than coal or oil and produces fewer emissions than alternative fossil fuels. From a global environmental perspective, Canadian energy exports often displace dirtier alternatives rather than adding new emissions to the atmosphere. More importantly, Canada's domestic energy security strategy includes massive investments in renewable energy infrastructure, battery storage technology, and clean energy manufacturing. The same domestic capacity that allows Canada to reduce energy exports also enables Canada to accelerate domestic decarbonization and clean energy development. The geopolitical implications of Canada's energy strategy extend far beyond the bilateral relationship with the United States. Other middle powers around the world are watching Canada's approach as a potential model for using geographic advantages to maintain sovereignty and independence in relationships with larger neighbors. Australia, which exports significant quantities of coal, iron ore, and liquefied natural gas to China, faces similar challenges in balancing economic relationships with strategic autonomy. Norway, which controls significant oil and natural gas resources in the North Sea, must navigate relationships with both European customers and Russian competitors. Brazil, which has substantial hydroelectric capacity and offshore oil reserves, could potentially use energy exports as leverage in regional relationships. The Canadian model demonstrates that middle powers do not need to accept subordinate relationships with larger neighbors simply because of economic size differences. Geographic advantages, strategic planning, and long-term infrastructure development can create leverage that allows smaller countries to negotiate as equals rather than as dependents. The technological implications of Canada's energy strategy are equally significant because they demonstrate how infrastructure investments can create permanent advantages that transcend temporary political relationships. The refinery capacity, electricity storage facilities, and LNG export terminals that Canada has built over the past 2 years represent billions of dollars in permanent infrastructure that will generate economic benefits for decades. This infrastructure also creates technological spillovers that benefit other sectors of the Canadian economy. The advanced refinery technology developed for processing oil sands crude has applications in petrochemical manufacturing and clean fuel production. The battery storage technology deployed for electricity grid management has applications in electric vehicle manufacturing and renewable energy development. The LNG export facilities provide technology and expertise that can be applied to other industrial gas processing applications. Most importantly, the integrated approach to energy infrastructure development demonstrates how countries can use their natural resource advantages to build advanced manufacturing capabilities rather than simply exporting raw materials. This represents a fundamental shift from the traditional resource economy model that has historically characterized Canadian energy development. As we look toward the future, the question is not whether Canada's energy strategy will succeed in the short term. The supply disruptions, price increases, and infrastructure advantages are already demonstrating the effectiveness of the geographic leverage approach. The real question is whether Canada can maintain the political will and strategic focus necessary to sustain this approach over the decades required to permanently reshape North American energy relationships. The American response will undoubtedly include efforts to reduce dependence on Canadian energy through domestic production increases, alternative supplier development, and demand reduction measures. Some of these efforts will succeed and will require Canada to adapt its strategy accordingly. However, the fundamental geographic advantages that enable Canadian energy dominance cannot be easily replicated or replaced by political decisions or economic policies. Canada controls vast energy resources, possesses ideal geography for renewable energy development, maintains political stability that enables long-term planning, and has demonstrated the technical capability to build world-class energy infrastructure. These advantages are permanent features of the North American geographic and political landscape that will continue to provide leverage regardless of changing political relationships or economic conditions. The energy pivot of February 2026 represents more than a policy change or temporary supply disruption. It represents the emergence of Canada as a truly sovereign energy power that uses its geographic advantages strategically rather than simply accepting whatever terms larger neighbors choose to dictate. This is the beginning of a new era in North American energy relationships, And the United States is discovering that dependency works both ways. The lights are still on in American cities, but they are burning with a new awareness of where the power comes from and who controls the switch. Thank you.